Good evening. How's everybody doing? A good Vok Shavua Tov. It's great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. That recording I was just playing was from a slichus singing 5 years ago to the day. Rosh Hashanah came a little bit earlier that year. But slichus, I think, is this coming week, right? So it's the... I forget the exact formula, but it's, in the week before Rosh Hashanah comes, we do the first slichas. I think it's after Shabbos. I forget which day of the week exactly, but late at night, like at 1:30 in the morning. And then for the rest of the week, we do it every morning. And it's these penitential prayers that help us prepare for Rosh Hashanah. So, you can see it was a little bit of a minor key, but we sing them in the same way that we sing the confession on Yom Kippur. There's this feeling that even though we're entering into the days of awe, we're entering into the days of judgment. Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment, right? When we receive a decree for the coming year, it is not sealed until Yom Kippur. But there's this idea that, the fix is in. Why? Because we know the judge. Not only do we know the judge, we love the judge, and the judge loves us. If the judge can find any reason to show us mercy and to give us a kind decree, he will, because he just adores us like a parent loves a child. And so we certainly want to examine our deeds with great caution and looking at all the minutiae of our lives and seeing where we could do better. And we should feel the proper shame and guilt for the transgressions that we've allowed ourselves to indulge in over the past year. But we don't let ourselves get down about that, because when we feel that holy shame, we're on our way to make that teshuvah, to make that atonement, to make that turning around, and understand that we're bigger, better people who would not do, God forbid, that transgression again. And maybe we'll fail, and maybe we'll fall off our intentions to not commit such a deed again. But eventually we can triumph over any deed that we know it's not us. It's not us. The Talmud defines that anytime a Jew sins, it was a spirit of folly that entered him, and it's not him. It's not his or her real state, not their natural state. And that should be a source of strength and confidence as we approach the days of awe. It doesn't let us off the hook for the sins that we've committed, for the things we've done wrong, the ways that we've wronged other people and wronged God. We're not off the hook. But there is a path of teshuvah. There's a way that we can make amends. And that should be a source of strength and joy. All right, my friends, who's in the house? Bill I'm at the top. Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Nancy, North Carolina, Joseph, Shalom and a good week, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in Chicago, Joe in the Empire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Ryan, saying Erev Tov Baruch Hashem, Rosh Hashanah is almost here. He's excited. Bill in mid-Missouri. Bill looking at the scheduling. I haven't figured it out yet, but yeah, exactly. There's I don't know. I don't know when it's going to be the class. We're going to have to take some days off during Rosh Hashanah and then during Sukkot, but we'll try to minimize the days in which I don't teach. Sharon enters Cy, the Talmud cat. Sandy in Michigan in the house. Belle in Texas. Guy in Ohio. Also on the YouTube side, Ella and Marjorie in the house. And also, I kind of have grown fond in the last year of our jungle sounds and rainforest and birds, the nature sounds that I've been playing. I think I'm going to stay with that. But today was, during the day was my mom's yard site, the first anniversary of her passing. And with that, when sunset came, we're past the yard site, and I can listen to music again. I haven't been to a concert or a live show all year. When I get in the car, driving around, I make phone calls or listen to the news or comedy, but I can start listening to music again. So I'm excited about that after this class ends tonight. I'll go inside with Nina. We'll probably turn on some music, some rock and roll. Okay, let's do this. Our daf. Oh, let's light up the darkness. Our page tonight is page 20 here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 in chapter 1. The sages taught concerning the following verse, which is referring to a Hebrew slave. If he comes in begapo, he shall leave begapo, which means that if he enters with his body, begufo, he shall leave with his body, begufo, right? So begapo and begufo sound different, but it's the same consonants. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, if he enters alone, he shall leave alone. And the Gemara clarifies, what is the meaning of the ruling that if he enters with his body, he shall leave with his body? And Rava said this means to say that he is not released through the loss of extremities like a Canaanite slave, meaning he does not leave his master because of damage done to his body. And Abaye said to Rava, this halacha is derived from a different verse, she shall not go out as the men slaves do. And Rava answers. So what they're discussing is what is the meaning of this idea that if a Jew ends up selling himself into 6 years of servitude because he's so poor, he feels he has no choice, or if he stole and he's unable to make restitution and the court sells him into those 6 years of servitude, so it says about him that he shall enter with his body and he shall leave with his body. Now the sages are debating what exactly does that mean. One idea is that the Canaanite slave, if his master in a fit of anger, breaks his tooth or cuts off a finger or something like that, if he loses, one of his extremities, so he goes free. That's it. His slavery is over. And that's a major change because the Hebrew slave was going to go free after 6 years. The Canaanite slave was going to be a slave forever. This damage will set him free. So what they're saying is that's for the Canaanite slave. For the Hebrew slave, if his master in a fit of anger, causes his body damage, as you'll see, he owes him compensation. Right? He has to pay damages like the way you would sue somebody if they injured you. The master is on the hook for that, but the slave's servitude does not end. Now, that's the suggestion that's been made. We'll see if the law comes out that way. Right, so now Rava said it's about the extremities, but Abaye said, no, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about that she shall not go out as the men slaves do, that the Hebrew maidservant is where we learn this law about if the master, physically damages the Hebrew slave, he gets compensated for it, but he doesn't go free. So Rava answers, if this law were derived only from there, I would say the master should give him the value of the eye that he took out and let him be released. In other words, one could say that the verse which states that a Hebrew maidservant does not leave as Canaanite slaves leave, which would serve as a source for the law of a Hebrew male slave as well, does not mean that she is not released at all due to the loss of her extremities. Rather, it means that unlike Canaanite slaves, she receives compensation for the injury as well as being released. So the Canaanite slaves don't get compensated, they just go free. The Hebrew slave gets compensated for having that kind of physical injury and goes free. Therefore, the verse, quote, if he comes with his body, he shall leave with his body, teaches us that this is not so. Rather, although the master must reimburse him for the loss of his eye, he is not freed as a result of the injury. Now, the Gemara discusses the second opinion in the Baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, if he enters alone, he shall leave alone. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of he shall leave alone? So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, this is what Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is saying. If the Hebrew slave has a wife and children when he is purchased, his master may provide him with a Canaanite maidservant for him to sleep with and create children that will be more Canaanite slaves. But if he did not have a wife and children, i.e. he enters alone, his master may not provide him with a Canaanite maidservant. You're like, what? So if the Jew was married before he became a slave, he's given a female slave to sleep with and procreate with. But if he was not married, then this does not happen for him. You're like, that sounds terrible. I mean, he has a wife at home. Why would you want him to sleep with some other woman? And what they're saying is, okay, first of all, while he's a slave, he doesn't own his body. His master owns his body and can cause him to procreate to make more Canaanite slaves. But they're only going to do that with a Jew who enters slavery while he's married, because if he's married, then when his servitude ends, he'll want to leave slavery and go back to his wife and children. Whereas if he entered slavery as a single man, and then he's given this Canaanite woman slave to procreate with, he'll fall in love with her. She can never leave slavery, so he will want to remain enslaved. That's the slave who pierces his ear and says, I choose to remain a slave with my master, not necessarily because his master is kind, as we've suggested before, but rather because he falls in love, and this is what the Torah says, because he falls in love with the Canaanite female slave, and in order to remain with her, he chooses to remain enslaved. And that's why you don't do that with a single man, as Rav Steinsaltz explains in the notes. Okay, let's continue. The sages taught with regard to a slave who was sold for 100 dinars, and he increased in value during his term of servitude, and his value stood at 200 dinars. From where is it derived that if he wishes to redeem himself, one assesses him for the payment of the remainder of his service based only on the calculation of 100 dinars, his value when originally purchased, as it is stated, out of the money that he was bought for. Leviticus 25:51. Right, so what they're discussing, the slave, when he sold himself into slavery, he was worth 100 dinars. So we know he has this option that halfway through his servitude, he can purchase himself out of slavery because somehow he found some money, a relative showed up, he won the lottery, I don't know. But now he has the money, so he gives it, if he sold himself for 100 dinars, he served for half the period. So if he pays 50 dinars, he can go free. But what happens if his value on the slave market, as it were, went up? So now do we calculate that? Well, he owes half of his servitude, but his new value is 200 dinars. So he actually owes the full 100 dinars, even though he's served half the period. Or do we assess his value as what he received when he went into slavery, and he only has to pay half of that? Then what about if it goes the other way? If he was worth 200 dinars when he entered slavery, he serves half the period, and now his value has gone down on the slave market. So does he have to pay half of the 200 that he was worth when he started, or does he pay half of the 100 that he is worth now? Bottom line, as we'll see, we assess the lower of the two values, whatever makes it easier for the slave to exit slavery. If he was sold for 200 dinars and decreased in value, and his value stood at 100 dinars, from where is it derived that when he is redeemed, one assesses him based only on the calculation of 100 dinars? And the verse states, according to his years, he shall give back the price of his redemption. Leviticus 25:52, meaning that he pays in accordance with the value of his remaining years of service. So I have derived this law only in the case of a slave sold to a Gentile, since the Torah is lenient with regard to his redemption, as he may be redeemed even by relatives who pay his money and free him. Consequently, in this case, the owner is at a disadvantage, and regardless of whether his value increased or decreased, the slave always pays the lower amount. Now, in a case where the slave was sold to his fellow Jew, from where do we derive that this law also applies to him? The verse states with regard to a Hebrew slave sold to a Jew, as a hired worker and as a settler he shall be with you. Leviticus 25:40. And it states with regard to one sold to a Gentile, as a hired worker, year by year he shall be with him. Leviticus 25:53. For a verbal analogy, the term hired worker is in both of these verses. And this verbal analogy teaches that the same law applies to one sold to a Gentile as to one sold to a Jew. When he was in a good mood, Abaye once said, "Behold, I am like the intellectually sharp Ben Azai, who would regularly expound on the Torah in the markets of Tiberias. I too am ready to answer any question put to me." Right? Abaye was feeling confident and cheerful. So one of the sages said to Abaye, after all, with regard to those verses, quote, out of the money that he was bought for, and, quote, according to his years, one could expound them leniently and assess the cost of redemption at the lower amount, right? That whether his value went up or his value went down during his period of servitude, he only has to pay to redeem himself according to the lower amount, right? That's expounding leniently. But the one who's questioning Abaye says, but one could in equal measure expound them stringently, i.e. we could say that the slave, in order to be redeemed, has to pay the higher amount. Right, whether his value went up or his value went down, we assess according to the higher value that he had at the beginning if his value went down, or that he has at the end if his value went up. What caused you to say we're going to be lenient in both cases rather than stringent in both cases? So Abaye answered, it cannot enter your mind to expound the verses stringently, as indicated from the fact that the merciful one is lenient with regard to his slave and is concerned about his well-being. As it is taught in a Baraisa, the verse states concerning a Hebrew slave, because he fares well with you, Deuteronomy 15:16, which teaches that the slave should be with you, i.e. treated as your equal in food, meaning that his food must be of the same quality as yours, and with you in drink, meaning that the drink he drinks is as good as your drink. Right? If you're drinking, $500 a bottle, single malt scotch, so does your slave. The Baraisa continues, this means that there shall not be a situation which you would eat fine bread and he eats inferior bread from coarse flour mixed with bran, which is low quality. And there shall not be a situation in which you drink aged wine and he drinks inferior new wine. I'm serious. Like if you drink that really fine booze, so does he. There shall not be a situation in which you sleep comfortably on bedding made from soft sheets, and he sleeps on straw. And from here, the sages stated, anyone who acquires a Hebrew slave, meaning a Jew who acquires another Jew as a slave, is considered like one who acquires a master for himself, because he must be careful that the slave's living conditions are equal to his own. Right? You might think, I'm a big guy, I have a slave attending to my needs, but the Torah imposes all these obligations towards your slave. It's not such a good thing. You'd be better off just having a housekeeper that you pay and who leaves at night. That sage who questioned Abaye asked him further, but one can say that this leniency in the case of a Hebrew slave apply, and Abaye is saying, since it has to be good for him when he is by you, right, living in your house. This would further indicate that you also, in order for him to purchase his freedom, you're going to assess at that lower value, right? That's what Abaye is arguing here for the question that he was asked. So that sage asked Abaye, but one can say that this leniency in the case of a Hebrew slave applies only to the matter of eating and drinking, so as not to cause him suffering during his servitude. But with regard to the matter of paying for his redemption, perhaps one should be stringent with him and assess his value at the higher value at the time he wants to be redeemed. The reason to be stringent is based on a statement of Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina. As it is taught in the Baraisa that Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, come and see how harsh is the violation of even a hint of the sabbatical year, i.e. how great are the punishments, not just for working the land, but also for treating lightly the sanctity of sabbatical year produce. I thought we were talking about whether we're going to be lenient or stringent in assessing the price of redemption for a Hebrew slave. Why are we talking about how stringent the laws of making sure you don't consume any sabbatical year produce? Why are we talking about these laws? Hang in there and you shall see. This is going to lead us right back around to the argument that we should be stringent with the slave. If a person has commercial dealings with sabbatical year produce, which is prohibited, ultimately he will become so poor that he will have to sell his movable property, right? So we're starting with the idea that if a person is so greedy that despite the known Torah prohibition on buying and selling the produce from his field that grows during the sabbatical year, right? Every 7 years when the temple was standing, the farmers would not harvest their fields. They would just let them grow a full year. They would not work the fields. And God had told us to do that. And he said, as long as you're living a Torah life as a nation, in the 6th year, the harvest will be so plentiful that you won't need to harvest in the 7th year. So when the nation was living at that level, they really could do that. Now, in the 7th year, there's all this produce going to waste. And somebody says, come on, it's just sitting out there. I'm going to buy and sell. I'm going to make some money. If you commit that sin, right, you're going to be punished measure for measure. You thought you could take a little more profit out of the land when it was prohibited for you to do so. God will show you the way you're going to be hurt is you're going to lose all profit in your life and you're going to end up impoverished, right? Ultimately, he will become so poor that he will have to sell his movable property. As it is stated in this Jubilee year, you shall return every man to his land. And juxtaposed to that verse, it says, and if you sell any item to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, right? That's Leviticus 25:13 and 25:14. And the juxtaposition of those two verses, they're saying is that if you're violating this law of the shmitta year, the sabbatical year, and then the Jubilee year even more, right? When there's a Jubilee every 50 years, 2 years in a row, you cannot harvest the land, the 49th and 50th year of that cycle. And if you violate, if you transgress that prohibition, right, the next verse talks about buying and selling items with your neighbor. And what they're saying is you're going to have to sell your movable property just so that you can eat. That's the interpretation. This teaches that if one sins with regard to the Jubilee year or the sabbatical year, which have many identical laws, he will eventually have to sell his movable property. If one does not sense that he is being punished and does not repent, ultimately he will have to sell his fields. As it is stated in an adjacent verse, if your brother grows poor and he sells off his ancestral land, if no move toward repentance comes to his hand, he will have to sell his house. As it is stated, and if a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city. In other words, what the sages are saying is that since the Torah says these are the laws you cannot violate, right? You cannot harvest the land during the sabbatical or the Jubilee year. And then nearby in the Torah following are verses talking about buying and selling your property, buying and selling your produce, buying and selling your fields of your ancestral heritage, and then buying and selling houses in a walled city, that this is going to be the consequences of you not realizing that the reason you're growing poor is because you were transgressing the law, and so it will become worse and worse for you. The Gemara asks, what is different there in the first sentence in which the Tana says he does not sense? And what is different there in the continuation in which the rabbi of this Baraisa says, if no move toward repentance comes to his hand? And the Gemara answers that this is in accordance with the statement of Rav Huna. As Rav Huna says, once a person commits a transgression and repeats it, it is permitted to him. And the Gemara immediately asks, can it enter your mind that it becomes permitted to him merely because he sinned twice? That suddenly because he commits the sin twice, now those transgressions that are prohibited in the Torah no longer apply to him? Like it's actually permitted? No, of course not. Rather, say it becomes to him as though it is permitted. Therefore, when he violates a prohibition a second time, the Baraisa takes for granted that he does not sense that he is performing a sin. And that's why the language changes. It goes from if he does not sense that he is doing wrong to if he does not make a move toward repentance. Now, as we approach the days of awe, let's just pause for 1 second and read that again. Once a person commits a transgression and then he repeats it, then he commits it again, it seems to him as though it is permitted. This is what people do all the time. They know something is wrong. And then in a moment of temptation, of self-indulgence, they do it anyway. You know what? Nothing happens. There's no consequence. So they do it again. And after they do it again the second time, they start to forget that it was wrong. And now they just start doing it again and again willy-nilly. And that person is slipping down that slippery slope, because once they see one thing that they knew was wrong and they did it anyway, nothing happened, and then it just seemed like it wasn't wrong anymore, that pattern is going to be repeated in other areas of their life. And that's why it's so important So important to guard ourselves from doing wrong. The good news is that even though, once we allow ourselves to do some sin twice and then we start acting like it's permitted and we forget that it was wrong, deep down we know it's wrong. And if we would just make one little move in the right direction, say, I know this is wrong, I gotta do better. God, please help me do better again tomorrow when this temptation comes up again. That thought, and then if you verbalize and articulate and ask God for help, provides such an opening, such an opportunity, and so much strength that if you just keep making that little move in the right direction, God will pull you out of that hole that you dug for yourself. The Gemara resumes its citation of the Baraisa. If no move toward repentance comes to his hand, his poverty will increase until he sells his daughter, as it is stated, and when a man sells his daughter as a maidservant. And the Gemara comments, and even though his daughter is not written with regard to that matter in Leviticus 25, but rather in Exodus, nevertheless, it teaches us this principle. A person will sell his daughter rather than borrow with interest. And what is the reason for this? His daughter can occasionally deduct money from her debt and use it to leave her master. But this interest continuously increases. The Baraisa continues, right? A person should rather sell his daughter as a slave than get into a high interest loan that he can never emerge from. That's not a should, that's just the way people act, says the Gemara. The Baraisa continues its exposition of the verses in Leviticus. If no move toward repentance comes to his daughter, he will eventually need to borrow with interest. As it is stated, and if your brother grows poor and his means fails with you, Leviticus 25:35. And juxtaposed to that is the verse, take no usury or interest from him. If no move, so he will take an interest-bearing loan from a non-Jew, and this is how he could end up enslaved to a non-Jew. And if no move toward repentance comes to his hand, he will eventually need to sell himself. As it is stated, and if your brother grows poor with you and he sells himself to you. And the Baraisa further states, not only will he be sold to you, a born Jew, but he will even be sold to a stranger, as it is stated, and he sells himself to a stranger, meaning a non-Jew. And this sale to a non-Jew is not referring to a sale to a righteous convert, but even to a Gentile who resides in the land of Israel and observes the 7 Noahide laws, as it is stated, and he sells himself to a stranger who is a settler among you. With regard to the continuation of the verse, or to an offshoot of a stranger's family, the Gemara expounds a stranger's family, this is the Gentile, i.e. he will reach a state where he has no choice but to sell himself to a Gentile. Right, so before it was the resident ger, not the Gentile, and now, he's selling himself to a Gentile. And when it says to an offshoot of a stranger's family, this is referring to one sold for idol worship itself. In other words, the descent from one who had land and a house and fields and produce and a family, and it was good with him, and he thought he could profit a little more by selling some of his produce during the sabbatical year, even though he knew it was prohibited. He will eventually start a cycle of falling off the wagon, as it were, becoming more and more desperate, selling off his goods, selling off his land, selling off his house in the city, selling off his daughter, and finally selling himself into slavery, and even to an idolater. Abaye, therefore, one should be stringent with him with regard to his redemption and not allow him to be redeemed easily, right? This guy's so off track that if he stopped, like he managed to sell himself to a Jew rather than to the idolater, don't be so quick to let him off the hook and let him purchase himself back for the lower price, right? If his value changed from when he started his servitude to when he now wants to try to redeem himself, maybe this is the reason that we should be stringent and charge him the higher price so that he doesn't fall back, doesn't become free again, continue his wicked ways, and end up sold to an idolater. It's for his benefit, maybe we should be stringent with him. That's the suggestion that's being made to Abaye. So Abaye answers, now we're on 20b, There, the verse brings him back, i.e., one must strive to redeem a Jew who has been sold as a slave. As the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, since this person who sold himself as a slave has gone and become a priest for idol worship, one might say, let us throw a stone after the fallen. That is, since he has reached this nadir, one should abandon him. Therefore, the verse states, Leviticus 25:48, after he is sold, he shall be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him. Abaye is saying there is no Jew who falls so low that we abandon him. Even if he has sold himself to an idolater, even if he has set himself up as a priest of idolatry, we would prefer he come back to the fold. We will help him come back to the fold. And now think of the Chabad movement, right? Sending shluchim, sending emissaries of the Chabad Rebbe to every corner of the globe to make Judaism available to Jews so that they can find their way back, right? What a beautiful, beautiful, venture that is. The Gemara further asks, but one can say as follows, quote, he shall be redeemed so that he will not be assimilated among the Gentiles. But with regard to the matter of his redemption and freedom, still we should act stringently with him, as derived from that which Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, that one is sold as a slave due to his sin. So why are we going to allow him to get out of slavery with the lower price, right? They're still arguing with Abaye. We should be more stringent, and if his value has gone up, he should have to pay more to get out of slavery. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, 2 verses are written with regard to the redemption of a slave sold to a Gentile. It is written, if there be yet many of the years, according to them, he shall give back the price of his redemption out of the money that he was bought for. And it is written, and if there remain but few of the years until the Jubilee year, he shall reckon with him according to his years. But how can there be both many years and few years? In any case, he will not serve for more than 6 years. Rather, this means that as the money of his value increased with the passage of time, he is redeemed out of the money that he was bought for, i.e. the price for which is originally sold, which is the lower sum. And if his monetary value decreased over time, one determines his value according to his years, according to the current value. Again, arguing that we're lenient and allow him to be redeemed for the lower value of his original purchase price if his value went up, or his current value if his value went down. The Gemara asks, but one can say that this is what the Torah is saying. In a case where he served for 2 years and an additional 4 years remain for his service, as indicated by the phrase, and if there be yet many years, let him give his redemption money for the 4 years he owes him, quote, out of the money that he was bought for. If he served 4 years and 2 years remain for his service, as it is stated, and if there remain but few of the years, let him give his redemption money according to the value of the 2 years, according to his years. Right? In other words, how can you learn out something about a purchase price? This is just talking about, the number of years. So the Gemara rejects this suggestion. If so, let the verse write, if there be yet many years, and if there remain but few years. What is the meaning of the phrase, of the years? This teaches that if his monetary value increased over the years of his servitude, he is redeemed out of the money that he was bought for, which is the lower sum. And if his monetary value decreased over the years of his servitude, one determines his value according to his years, the current price. Upon hearing this statement, Rav Yosef said, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak homiletically interpreted these verses like Sinai. His exposition reflects the truth of the Torah as it was given at Mount Sinai, as every matter is fully resolved. Well done. Well done, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. And where we come out is that the Hebrew slave can redeem himself out of servitude for the lower price. If his value went up, then what the purchase price originally, if his value went down, then his current value. Now, the Gemara records a mnemonic device for the upcoming discussion. Slave, house, partial, house, slave, and relatives. Right? Remember that all of that we're reading. Now, it's much longer than what the Gemara is actually written as because there's an elucidation here by Rav Steinsaltz helping us to understand what's going on. But nevertheless, the Gemara, is many, many volumes, and originally it was all memorized. The whole Mishna was memorized. The whole Gemara was memorized. Now we have the treat that we can read it in books. But imagine that this is all memorized by the sages, And so then you understand why they needed mnemonic devices to help them understand things like this. Okay, so Rav Huna bar Chinana raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshes with regard to a Hebrew slave who is sold to a Gentile. Can he be partially redeemed or can he not be partially redeemed? Does this slave have the option of paying part of his value and thereby reducing his remaining period of service? The Gemara analyzes the two sides of the dilemma. With regard to a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile, the verse states, according to his years, he shall give back the price of his redemption. And the meaning of the term redemption here, geulato, can be derived from the same term stated with regard to the redemption of an ancestral field. And he becomes rich and finds sufficient means to redeem it, geulato. So accordingly, just as an ancestral field cannot be partially redeemed, rather it is either fully redeemed or not at all, so too, this slave cannot be partially redeemed. Or perhaps we say that he cannot be partially redeemed only if that leads to a leniency, but we do not say that he cannot be partially redeemed if it leads to a stringency. So Rav Sheshes said to him, didn't you say there with regard to a thief who is sold to repay what he stole, that the verse, and he is sold, Exodus 22:2, teaches that all of him is sold, but not part of him. If he is worth 1,000 and he owes 500 for theft, he cannot be sold. So too, in the case of one who was sold to a Gentile, the phrase, he is redeemed, means all of him and not part of him. In other words, let's say that this Jew sold himself to a Gentile for 1,000 dinar. And so now his family wants to buy him back and free him from that slavery, but they only have 500 dinars. So can they say to the Gentile, okay, we'll give you 500 dinars. Now we're going to be partners. He's going to be half yours and half ours. So half the time he's among us and, can be free or work for us. And the other half the time he's your slave. And eventually we'll give you the other half and then purchase him fully. But for now, we're going to co-own him with you. Is this possible? Abaye said, if you say that he is partially redeemed, you find elements of both leniency and stringency. This ruling can lead to a leniency in the following case. A master purchased a Hebrew slave for 100, and the redeemer gives him 50, which is half of his value. And afterward, the slave increased in value and stood at 200. So if you say that he can be partially redeemed, he is already half redeemed. Consequently, the redeemer gives him 100, half of his current value, and the slave goes out, i.e. he is redeemed. And if you say that he cannot be partially redeemed, then the redeemer gives the owner an additional 150 in order for the slave to go out, because the initial 50 served merely as a down payment, not a half payment. So the Gemara asks, but you said that if the money of his value increased, one always pays out of the money that he was bought for, i.e. one calculates the value of the slave in accordance with his value at the time when he was acquired, even if that is less than his present value. Why then should one have to pay the full 200? And the Gemara answers, this is referring to a case where he initially, before being sold, increased in value, was then sold for 200 and afterward decreased in value to 100. And subsequently, he again increased in value so that he was worth the same amount as he was originally. In this case, his value of 200 remains determinative. Abaye proceeds to describe how you find a case that leads to a stringency. So if a master, now they're being sort of, right, Abaye is being clever, maybe a little bit sliding into the hypothetical range, but he's testing us. What are we trying to say here, right? Are we going to say just because we want him to get out of slavery that we can therefore, rule leniently and say, okay, it's better for him if he's partially redeemed, we're going to get him out sooner? Can't do that because that might not be the law. So now Abaye is testing the law, or our understanding of the law. So Abaye proceeds how you can find a case that leads to a stringency. A master purchased a Hebrew slave for 200, and the redeemer gave 100, which is half of his value. And the slave decreased in value and stood at the value of 100. If you say that he can be partially redeemed, the redeemer gives 50 and the slave goes out, i.e. he's redeemed. And if you say that he cannot be partially redeemed, well, these 100 are a deposit with him. Therefore, the redeemer gives it to him at the time of the redemption and the slave goes out. And there's no reason to pay him more money as he is now worth 100. Rav Huna bar Chanana raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshes with regard to a similar topic. In the case of one who sells a house from among the houses of walled cities, which can be redeemed only during the first year after the sale. Can it be partially redeemed or can it not be partially redeemed? And the Gemara explains the sides of the dilemma. Does he derive the verbal analogy of geulato, from Leviticus 25:29 and geolatu from Leviticus 25:26 from the case of an ancestral field, and say that just as an ancestral field, right, meaning a field that was granted to a family at the time that Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land, and it became part of that family's heritage. And if somebody sells that land, he's only selling it until the Jubilee year, and then it comes back to the family. Unless somebody consecrates it and gives it to the temple treasury, and then the temple treasury, before this person redeems it back, he has a year to do that. Then if the temple treasury sells it to some other person, then it doesn't come back in the Jubilee year. So this is that area of the law that we're talking about. And so that's why they're talking about either the field is redeemed or it's not. No partial redemption. So are we going to apply that same law to houses in walled cities, which are a little bit different? A house that you sell in a walled city, the seller has the option to purchase it back for 1 year. And if he doesn't exercise it, that's a permanent sale. There is no coming back in the Jubilee year. So, or perhaps one should say, in a case where the verse explicitly revealed that it cannot be redeemed partially, as it does in the context of ancestral fields, okay, the Torah revealed that. But with regard to one who redeems with regard to an ancestral field, it is written, and he becomes rich and finds sufficient means to redeem the field, indicating that he has enough money to redeem the whole field, not part of it. But by contrast, in the case where the Torah did not reveal that it cannot be redeemed, it did not reveal that. And therefore, a house from a walled city can be partially redeemed, as the verse does not state this condition in that context. Rav Shesha said to him, from Rabbi Shimon's interpretation, one learns that with regard to houses in walled cities, one can borrow money and redeem them, and similarly that one can partially redeem them, as it is taught in the Baraisa with regard to a verse that describes one who consecrates his field, and if he will redeem the field, the repetition of the verb teaches that one can borrow money and redeem houses in walled cities, and that one can also partially redeem them because they're treated differently than fields. Rabbi Shimon said, what is the reason for this law? This is because we find with regard to one who sells his ancestral field that his power is enhanced, as if the Jubilee year arrives and it is not redeemed, the ancestral field returns to its owners in the Jubilee year without them having to pay anything. Therefore, the power of the seller is diminished in that he cannot borrow money and redeem the field, but must have the money to do so on his own, and he cannot partially redeem it. By contrast, if one consecrates his field, right, he gives it to the temple treasury, then he diminishes his own power. As if the Jubilee year arrives and he did not yet redeem it from the temple treasury, and the temple treasury sold it to someone else, then the ancestral field goes out and becomes the property of the priests in the Jubilee year. If the priests, the temple treasury sold it to someone else, and the original owner didn't redeem it, then when the Jubilee year arrives, it goes out of the hands of that purchaser, but it returns to the temple treasury, not to the original people who consecrated it. So consequently, in order to offset this stringency, his power is enhanced in that he may borrow money and redeem the field and even partially redeem it. So according to this explanation, with regard to one who sells a house from among the houses of walled cities, since his power is also diminished, as if a full year passes and the house has not been redeemed, it remains the permanent property of the buyer. In order to offset this stringency, his power should be enhanced in that he may borrow money and redeem the house, and even partially redeem it. Rava Bar Chinana raised an objection to this opinion from a Baraisa. The verse states with regard to one who consecrates his field, and if he will redeem Gaol Yigal, the field, this teaches that he may borrow money and redeem it, and even partially redeem it. And the Baraisa continues, as one might have thought, could this not be derived through a Kal V'chomer inference? Just as with regard to one who sells an ancestral field, that his power is enhanced, as if the Jubilee year arrives and it is not redeemed, it returns to its own original owners in the Jubilee year, and yet his power is diminished in that he cannot borrow money and redeem the field, and he cannot partially redeem it. Then, with regard to one who consecrates a field where his power is diminished, for if the Jubilee year arrives and it was not redeemed, it goes out to the priests in the Jubilee year. Is it not logical that his power is diminished in that he cannot borrow money and cannot redeem the field, and he cannot partially redeem it? The Baraisa raises a difficulty with this Kal V'chomer inference. What is unique about one who sells his ancestral field is that his power is diminished with regard to redeeming it immediately, as he cannot redeem his field right away but must wait at least 2 years. Shall you say that the same laws apply with regard to one who consecrates his field, as his power is enhanced with regard to the redeeming it immediately? One who has consecrated his field can redeem it as soon as he has the money to do so. If so, the Kal V'chomer inference is not valid. And the Baraisa responds, the case of one who sells a house from among the houses of walled cities can prove otherwise, as his power is enhanced with regard to redeeming it immediately, and yet he cannot borrow money and redeem the house, and he cannot partially redeem it. In any case, with regard to the issue at hand, the Baraisa indicates the opposite of the previous conclusion. One who sells a house in a walled city cannot partially redeem it. And Rav Sheshes answers, La Kasha, this is not difficult. This second Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And that Baraisa, which teaches that one can borrow money and redeem the house and partially redeem it, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara states it is taught in one Baraisa with regard to the houses of walled cities, one can borrow money and redeem it, and one cannot partially redeem it. And it is taught in another Baraisa, one cannot borrow money and redeem it, nor can one partially redeem. Apparently, there is a contradiction between these two Baraisas. And the Gemara answers as above, this is not difficult. This Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and that Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. That's where we're going to leave off. Take a couple of questions. So tomorrow we are going to have the class normal time at 6 p.m. Then Nina and I have to rush off to a shul dinner. So going to keep it moving nice and snappy. Tomorrow's class at 6 p.m. Okay, a couple of quick questions. If Google Docs will load up. Here we go. Sharon, I am not clear why the temple takes ownership in the Jubilee year, not the original owner. The Torah sets the guidelines for the Jubilee year, and the temple was not yet in existence. Very good. But the Mishkan was, right? So you could consecrate something and give it to essentially the Kohanim. You're giving it for the service of God. You're giving it into the realm of the Kohanim. So even before the temple was built, you had the priests who were tending, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then in the various places where the tabernacle resided. And so you had this distinction. If you consecrated your land, it's obviously not because you're poor, right? That you didn't sell your field to get money. You consecrated it in order just to give it as a free will gift to the temple. Now you might regret that and you can buy it back, but if you didn't, you'd think that, you're trying to do something holy, and so there should be this escape clause, and there is for a certain amount of time. But at a certain point it ends. I'm with you. It's not easy to understand, but at any rate, there was a tabernacle before the temple. And finally, Joseph, what exactly is being redeemed? Does that mean to be freed? Redeemed also means purchased, right? So if you consecrate something and you redeem it back, right? You have to you gave something to the temple. In order to take that out of the realm of the temple, you have to provide its equivalent value, because you gave a gift to the Lord. You can't take it back, but you can't exchange it. And so that's what redemption means. And likewise, you sell yourself into slavery, you can be redeemed. You're going out of slavery, but you do that by giving the money that you owe for the years that you do not serve. And that's why redemption has this value, this definition not only of going free, but also of exchanging value in order to remove something from another domain. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Good Vok, Shavua Tov. Have a great week.